Section 9 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by E. Henderson. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Pretty Maruschka. Far away in the hazy purple of antiquity, when all stepmothers were wicked and all younger sons were successful, there lived on the confines of a forest a woman who had two daughters, the one her own, the other only a stepchild. Naturally, the love of the mother was concentrated on her own, Helena, and as naturally she disliked Maruschka, who was the fairest, the gentlest, and the most pious of the two girls. Little did pretty Maruschka know of her own surpassing beauty, a fact proving to us how remote from the present age was that in which these damsels lived. Her hair was like the waving gold of the cornfield when the wind sows over it, and her eyes were as the blue forget-me-not which smiles and glimmers in a quiet nook by the brookside. She was slim and graceful, her step was light, for her heart was free. Wherever she went, she brought cheerfulness and smiles, like the golden sunbeams which pierce among the tree shadows of a forest, and light up unexpected beauties where all before was gloom. Now painting a saffron butterfly, now kindling an emerald moss tuft, now making a scarlet lily flame against the dusk of the forest glades behind. Helena was dressed by her mother in grey colours for Sunday and feast day, but poor little Maruschka only had a dingy grey gown cast off by her sister. Helena wore black shoes with silver buckles, but pretty Maruschka clattered up the churchyard path in wooden clogs. Helena wore a false gold chain of great links around her neck, but her half-sister only had a turquoise-coloured ribbon and a little silver cross with a crystal in it. That was her only adornment, and that had been given to her by a lady whom she had guided into the road when she had lost her way in the forest. As the mother and the two girls went to church on Sundays, the lads were all in the yard, hanging about the tombstones, and the woman heard them whisper, "There is pretty Maruschka," but never once did they say, "See pretty Helena." So she was angry, and she hated the golden-haired, blue-eyed maiden. At home she made her do all the hard work, scrub the floors, cook the victuals, mend the clothes, while Helena stood all day before her glass, combing her hair and adorning herself with trinkets, and wishing it were Sunday, that she might flare before the eyes of the young men in the churchyard. Helena and her mother did all that lay in their power to make the little girl's life miserable. They scolded her, they beat her, they devised schemes of annoyance for her, but never could they ruffle the sweet temper of Maruschka. One day, in the depths of winter, Helena cried out, "Ah me, would that I had a bunch of violets in my bosom to-morrow when I go to church! Run, Maruschka, run into the forest and pluck them for me, that I may have them to smell at whilst the priest gives us his sermon." "Oh, my sister," answered Maruschka, "who ever heard of violets being gathered in midwinter under the deep snow?" "Idle hussy!" screamed Helena. "Go at once and fetch them. Have them I will, and you shall not come back without them." Then the mother chimed in with, "Mind and bring a large bunch, or you shall not be taken in here for the night. Go!" And she caught her, thrust her from the house, and slammed the door behind her. Bitterly weeping, the poor maiden wandered into the forest. The snow lay deep everywhere, untainted by human foot. White wreaths hung on the bushes, and sombre pine boughs were frosted over with snow. Here were traces of a hare, there were prints of a badger. An owl called from the depths of the forest. The girl lost her way. Dusk came on, and a few stars looked through the interlacing boughs overhead, watching Maruschka. An icy wind moaned through the trees, shaking the pines as though they quaked with mortal fear, and then they bent their branches and shot their loads of snow and dust to the ground. Strange, harp-like sounds reverberated through the gloom, and grating of bough on bough, which seemed as though the wood-demons were gnawing at fallen timbers. Now a great black crow, which had been brooding among the dark firs and pines, startled by the footfall and sobs of the maiden, expanded his wings, and with a great harsh scream rushed away noisily, sending the life-blood with a leap to the girl's heart. Suddenly, before her, far up on a hilltop, a light appeared, ruddy and flickering. Maruschka, inspired with hope, made for it, scrambling up a rocky slope through deep snowdrifts. She reached the summit and beheld a great fire. Around this fire were 12 rough stones, and on each stone sat a man. 3 were grey-bearded, 3 were middle-aged, 3 were youths, and the last 3 were the youngest and fairest. They spoke not, but looked intently on the roaring flames. He who sat in the seat of honour had a long staff in his hand. His hair was white and fluttering in the cold wind. Maruschka was startled, and watched them with astonishment for a little while. Then, mustering courage, she stepped within the circle and said, "Dear good friends, please suffer me to warm myself a little while at the fire, for indeed I am perishing with cold." He with the flowing white hair raised his head and said, "Yes, child, approach. But what brings you here?" "I am seeking violets," she answered. "Violets? It is not the time for violets when the snow lies deep." "Ah, sir, I know that well, but Sister Helena and Mother have bidden me bring them violets, and if I do not I must perish in the cold. You kind shepherds, tell me where I may find violets." Then the white-aged one arose from his seat, stepped to one of the blooming youths, put his staff in his hand, and said, "Brother March, take thou the preeminence." Then the month March sat himself on the chief stone and waved his staff over the fire. Instantly the flames rushed up and blazed with greater brilliancy. The snow began to thaw, the hazel bushes were covered with catkins, and glossy buds appeared on the beach. Green herbs thrust up through the moist soil, a primrose gleamed from a dusky bank, and a sweet fragrance of violets was wafted by on a gentle breeze. Under a bush the ground was purple with their scented blossoms. "Quick, Maruschka, pluck!" ordered March. The girl hastily gathered a handful. Then she curtsied to the 12 months, thanked them cordially, and hurried home. Helena was amazed when her half-sister came with the bunch to the door. She opened it to her, and the house was filled with the delicious odour. "Where did you find them?" she asked. "High up on the mountain, under a hawthorn bush." Helena took the flowers and set them in her bosom. She let her mother smell at them, but she never gave one to Maruschka. When they came home from church the next day, Helena cast off her grey shawls and sat down to supper, but she had no appetite for what was on the table. She was angry with her sister, for all the lads had fixed their eyes on Maruschka, and had not even been attracted to her by the fragrant bunch of violets. "How beautiful is Maruschka to-day!" had said one of the older people, and none had spoken a good word of her. So she sat and sighed, and hated the pretty girl more and more. "Oh, that I had strawberries!" she said. "I can eat nothing this evening but strawberries. Run, Maruschka, into the forest and gather me a dishful." "Dear sister, this is not the time of the year for strawberries. Who ever heard of strawberries ripening under the snow?" But the stepmother angrily exclaimed, "Run, Maruschka, fetch them at once, as your sister has ordered, or I will strike you dead!" And she thrust her from the door. The poor girl cried bitterly. She looked back at the firelight which glimmered through the casement, and thought how warm it was within, whilst without it was so piercingly cold. But she dared not return unless she had with her the desired fruit, so she plunged into the forest. The snow lay deep, and nowhere was a human footprint. Snow began to fall in fine powder, whitening her shoulders, clinging to the folds of her grey dress, and forming a cap of ice on her golden hair. In that dull rayless night there was no light to show the blue ribbon which strayed among the tree-boles, or to twinkle on the crystal of the silver cross. Presently Maruschka saw, high up on the summit of a rugged hill, a blazing fire. She scrambled to it, and there she found the 12 sitting solemn and silent around the flames, and the Ice Month, with his staff, sat on the seat of honour. "Dear good friends, please suffer me to warm myself a little while at the fire," she asked in a beseeching voice, "for indeed I am perishing with cold." Then the one with the drifting white locks raised his head and said, "Yes, child, approach. But what brings you here?" "I am seeking strawberries," she answered. "Strawberries? It is not the time for strawberries when the snow lies deep." "Ah, sir, I know that, but Sister Helena and Mother have bid me bring them strawberries, or they will strike me dead. You, kind shepherds, tell me where I may find strawberries." Then the Ice Month arose from his seat, stepped across the area to one of the young men, put the staff into his hand, and said, "Brother June, take thou the preeminence." Then the month June sat himself on the chief stone, and waved his staff over the fire. Instantly it glowed like molten gold. Beams of glory streamed from it through the forest, and it shone like a sun resting on the earth. Overhead the clouds flamed and curled in wreaths of light-tinted rose, carnation and purple athwart a sky blue as the forget-me-not, Every trace of snow vanished, and the earth was buried in green. The trees were covered with rustling leaves. Bluebells gleamed under their shadows and then died away. Red robin blushed in tufts and then shed its ragged petals. Wild roses burst into glorious flower, and the soft air was charged with the scent of the sweet briar. From among the forest glades called, in cool notes, a wood-dove. The thrush began to warble, and the blackbird to pipe. A bright-eyed squirrel danced among the fresh green leaves on the tree-tops. Beside a brown stone was a patch of sloping green. It was dotted with little white stars with golden hearts. Now the leaves drop off, and the hearts swell and flush and glow and become crimson. "Quick, Maruschka, pluck!" said June. Then the girl joyfully hurried to the slope and gathered an apronful of the luscious strawberries. She curtsied to the 12 months, thanked them cordially, and hurried home. Helena was astonished as she saw her come to the house, and she ran to open the door. The whole cottage was fragrant with the odor of the strawberries. "Where did you gather them?" asked Helena. "High up on the mountains under a brown rock." Helena took the strawberries and ate them with her mother. She never offered even one to pretty Maruschka. Next day Helena again had no appetite for her supper. "Oh, if only I had ripe apples!" she said. And then, turning to her sister, she ordered, "Run, Maruschka, run into the wood and gather me some ripe apples." "Dear sister, this is not the time of the year for apples. Who ever heard of apples ripening in an icy wind?" But her stepmother cried out, "Run, Maruschka, fetch the apples as your sister has required, or I will strike you dead!" And she thrust her from the door into the cold winter night air. The maiden hastened, sobbing, into the wood. The snow lay deep, and nowhere there was a human footprint. The new moon glimmered in a clear sky, and sent its feeble beams into the forest depths, forming trembling, silvery pools of light, which appeared and vanished and formed again. And a low wind whispered a great secret in the trees, but so faint the tone that none could make out what it said. There was a little opening in the wood. In the midst stood a grey wolf, looking at the moon and howling. But when Maruschka came near, it fled, and was lost among the shadows. The poor maiden shivered with cold, and her teeth chattered. Her lips were purple, and her cheeks white, and the tears as they formed froze on her long eyelashes. She would have sunk on a snowdrift and died, had she not seen, up high on a rugged hilltop, a blazing fire. Towards it she made her way, and found it to be the same she had seen before. Round about, solemn and silent, sat the 12, and the Ice Month was at the seat of honour, clasping the staff of power. "Dear good friends, please suffer me to warm myself a little while at the fire," she asked in supplicating tones, "for indeed I am perishing with cold." Then the one with the long white hair and frosty beard raised his head and said, "Yes, child, approach, but what brings you here?" "I am seeking ripe apples," she answered. "Ripe apples? It is not the time for ripe apples when the snow lies deep." "Ah, sir, I know that well, but sister Helena and mother have bidden me bring them ripe apples, or they will strike me dead. You, kind shepherds, tell me where I may find ripe apples." Then the Ice Month arose from his seat, stepped to one of the elder men, put the staff in his hand, and said, "Brother September, take thou the preeminence." Then the month September sat himself on the chief stone, and waved his staff over the fire, whereat it glowed like a furnace, red and fierce. Sparks flew about, and volumes of glaring hot smoke, like the vapour of molten metal, rolled up to heaven. In a moment the snow was gone. The trees were covered with sere leaves, and the oak foliage was brown and crumpled, that of the ash yellow as sulphur. Other trees seemed leaf with copper. Stray leaves floated past, and were whirled by little wind eddies into rustling heaps. A few yellow flowers shook in the hot air. Pinks hung over the rocks, covering their faces with wandering shadows. Ladyfern waved and wafted its pleasant odour. A constant hum of bees and beetles and flies sounded through the wood. Maruschka looked around her for apples, and beheld a tree on whose branches hung the ruddy fruit. "Quick, Maruschka, shake!" commanded September. Then she shook, and there fell an apple. She shook again, and there fell another. "Quick, Maruschka, hasten home," said the month. Then she curtsied to the 12, thanked them cordially, and returned to the house of her stepmother. Helena marvelled not a little when she saw the red apples. "How many have you plucked?" she asked. "Only 2. Where did you find them?" "High up on the mountain top, on a tree way down with them." "Why did you not gather more? Did you not eat them on your way home?" asked Helena fiercely. "Oh, dear sister, I have not tasted one. I shook once, and down fell an apple. I shook twice, and there fell another. I might not bring away more." Helena struck her, and drove her to the kitchen. Then she tasted one of the apples. Never before had she eaten one so sweet and juicy. The stepmother ate the second. "Mother," exclaimed Helena, "give me my fur dress. I will go to the hill and bring some apples. That hussy has eaten all she took except 2. Then she wrapped herself up and hurried into the woods. The snow lay deep, and nowhere was a human footprint. Helena lost herself, but presently she was aware of a hill and a fire burning at the summit. She hastened to the light. There she saw a great blaze, and round it sat the 12 months, silent and solemn. He with the long snowy locks sat in the seat of honour, holding the rod of power. Helena stared at them, then pushing through the circle, went to the fire and began to warm herself. "What seek you here?" asked the Ice Month, with a frown wrinkling his white brow. "That is no business of yours," answered Helena sharply over her shoulder. The Ice Month shook his head, and, raising his arm, waved the staff over the fire. Instantly the flames sank, and the fire was reduced to a glowing spark. The clouds rolled over the sky, and, bursting, discharged snow in such quantities that nothing was visible in earth and heaven but drifting white particles. An icy wind rumbled in the forest and roared around the hill. Helena fled. Everywhere white, fleeting spots, whirling, falling, rising, scudding. She ran this way, then that. She stumbled over a fallen log and gathered herself up and ran again. Then she plunged into a deep drift, and the white cold down from the breast of heaven whirled and fell and rose and fleeted and danced this side of her, and dropped here on her, and rested there on her, and lodged on this limb, and built up a white heap on that limb, then bridged over one fold and filled up another. She shook herself and the particles fell off, but then they began their work again. They spangled her with white, they wove a white net, they filled up the interstices of her lace, they built a mound over her arm, they buried her foot, they raised a cairn above her bosom. Then they spun a dance around the white face which looked up at them, and began to whiten it still more. Lastly they smoothed the sheet over her, and the work was done. The mother looked out the window, and wondered that Helena did not return. Hour after hour passed, and the daughter came not. "Maybe the apples are so sweet that she cannot eat enough," thought the mother. "I will go seek them too." So she wrapped herself up in a thick shawl and went forth. The snow lay deep, and nowhere was a human footprint. She called Helena, but received no answer. Then she lost her way. The snow fell and the wind howled. Maruschka sat over the fire and cooked supper. Mother and sister came back no more. Notes. Pretty Maruschka, a Slavonic tale. It is properly Slovakian and is given by Wenzig in his West Slavischer Martienschatz 1857. The story has a mythological importance, on account of the impersonation of the 12 months represented as seated round the great central fire of the sun. The fire wheel occurs in traditional usage, not only in Slavonic, but also in Gaulish lands. End of section 9. Recording by E. Henderson.
Section 10 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sash Elliott. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Beauty and the Beast. There was a merchantman once who was very rich. He had 3 daughters, and he spared no expense to provide them with an excellent education. His daughters were beautiful, but the youngest so excelled her sisters that, from earliest childhood, she was called the Beauty, and afterwards this name slipped into, simply, Beauty. But the real cause why she was so much more admired than her sisters was that she was amiable, and they were not, and the sweetness of her disposition shone out in her face and made it doubly sweet. No frown ever spoiled her fair brow, no pout was ever on her pleasant lips. She possessed the charm of a good temper, which makes even a plain face agreeable. The merchant's elder daughters were idle, ill-humoured, and proud, and people did not consider them as beautiful, because they saw only the bad temper that was in the expression of their faces. The pride of the young ladies was so great that they despised all such as were of their own rank in life, and wished to be the friends of noble ladies and princesses. They hunted after grand acquaintances, and met with many mortifications accordingly. They gave themselves great airs, and, to show the world how high in life they were, they held up their noses. Their whole time was spent in balls, operas, and visiting and driving about. Meanwhile, Beauty kept to her books, and, when not at work, she loved in kindly way to go among the sick and poor and comfort them. Thus it came about that she was as much beloved by the poor as she was admired by the rich. As it was well known that their father was a well-to-do man, many merchants asked the girls in marriage, but all these offers were refused because the two eldest daughters had set their minds on marrying only nobles, and the youngest had no wish to be married at all. Beauty's great desire was to be with her father when he was old and feeble, and to be then his comfort. One unhappy day the merchant returned home, very downcast, to inform his children that his ships had been wrecked, his head clerk had defrauded him, and that the firms which owed him money were bankrupt. He was, therefore, a ruined man. Beauty wept because her father was unfortunate and unhappy, and asked him what was to be done. "Alack, dear child," he replied, "I must sell this house and go live in a cottage in the country, and we shall have to work with our hands to put bread into our mouths." "Well, father," said Beauty, "I can spin and knit and sew very neatly. I dare say I shall be able to help you." Their elder daughters said nothing, but resolved to marry such of their rejected lovers as were richest. They speedily found, however, that their rejected lovers rejected all their advances, now that they were poor. On the other hand, such as had admired Beauty pressed their services on her, and would gladly have shared their fortunes with her. She, however, could not think of deserting her father when he was reduced to low estate. She felt she must abide by him and work for him. Very soon the grand house in town was sold, as well as all the rich furniture, and the merchant and his daughters retired into the country. Beauty now rose at 4 o'clock every morning. She cleaned the house, laid and lighted the fires, prepared the breakfast, and put flowers on the table. Then she cooked the dinner and made the house tidy. She was happy, and sang like a lark over her work, and slept peacefully, and had pleasant dreams. Meanwhile, her sisters grew peevish, dissatisfied, and miserable. They would not work, and as they had no occupation and no amusement, the days dragged along and seemed as though they would never end. They did nothing but regret the past and grumble over the present. As they had no one to admire them, they neglected their personal appearance, and became veritable dowdies. Perhaps they perceived that the contrast between their sister and themselves was not to their advantage, for they became spiteful in their manner to Beauty, and held up their hands and declared that she had always been fit only to be a servant. "It is clear as daylight," they said to Beauty, "that nature made you to occupy a menial position, and now you are in your proper place. As for us, we are ladies. We can't soil our fingers, we can't dust the furniture, we can't scrub the floor. We are above such things." The merchant heard, after a while, that there was some chance of retrieving part of his fortune if he made a journey to a country where one of his richest vessels had been wrecked. He must claim what had been recovered from the sea. Accordingly, he bade his daughters farewell, and he did so in a hopeful spirit, for he believed he would get back enough to make their life more comfortable. Before leaving, he asked his daughters what they would desire him to bring for them on his return, as a little token that he remembered them. The eldest asked for a diamond necklace. The second wished for a whole suite of pearls. The youngest said, "Dear father, bring me a white rose." So the father kissed all his daughters and departed. He was successful, and had recovered so much of his property that he hoped to reopen his business, and in time recover all that was lost. When he prepared to return home, he remembered the requests of his daughters, and bought diamonds for the eldest and pearls for the second, but he sought everywhere in vain for a white rose. This distressed him greatly, as his youngest daughter was his favourite child. Now, as he was on his way home, he lost his way in a wood. Night was closing in, and as the merchant was aware that there were wolves, bears, and wild boars in that country, he was very anxious to find a shelter for the night. Presently he perceived in the distance a twinkling light, and he urged his horse in that direction. But, to his surprise, instead of coming to a woodman's hut, he found himself in front of a magnificent castle, to which led a stately avenue, composed of orange and lemon trees hung with fruit. He did not hesitate to pass down this avenue, and at the end he came to the steps leading to the front gate, and through the open door shone the light that had attracted him. He entered, having first knocked at the door, and looked round him expecting to see servants, but no one responded to his knock, and the hall was wholly deserted. He passed through several galleries and empty rooms, all illuminated and all empty, and finally stayed his course in a smaller apartment where a fire was burning and a couch was prepared as if for someone to lie on it. Being very tired and cold, he cast himself down on the couch and fell asleep. After a pleasant and refreshing slumber he awoke and found he was still alone, but a little table stood by him, and on it was spread a delicious repast. As he was extremely hungry, he sat at the table and partook all of the good things on it. Then he threw himself on the couch again, and again fell asleep. When he awoke, the morning sun shone into the room. The little table was still at his side, but on it was now spread an excellent breakfast. The merchant began now to be very uneasy at the intense stillness of the house, and perplexed at seeing no one. He left the little room and entered the garden, which was beautifully laid out, and was full of flowers. "Well," said the merchant to himself, "this wonderful place seems to have no master. I will go home and bring my daughters to it, and we shall be able to claim it as our home, for I discovered it, and it belongs, as far as I can see, to no one." He then went to fetch his horse, and as he turned down the path to the stable, he saw a hedge of white roses on each side of it. Thereat the merchant remembered the request of his youngest daughter, and he plucked one to take to her. Immediately he was alarmed by hearing a horrible noise. Turning in the direction of the sound, he saw a frightful beast, which seemed to be very angry, and which exclaimed, "Who gave you permission to gather my roses? Was it not enough that I suffered you to lie on my couch, and warm yourself at my fire, and eat my supper and breakfast? Your insolence shall not go unpunished." The merchant, terrified at these words and threats, dropped the rose, and casting himself on his knees, cried, "Forgive me, sir. I am sincerely grateful for your hospitality, which was so profuse that I hardly thought you would grudge me one rose." The beast's anger was not mitigated by this speech. "I pay no regard to your excuses," said he. "You shall most certainly die." "Alas!" exclaimed the merchant. "Oh, Beauty, Beauty, why did you ask this fatal thing of me? The white rose you desired will be the death of your father." The beast asked the merchant the meaning of this exclamation, and the merchant then related the story of his misfortunes and of the requests made by his daughters. "It cost me nearly all I recovered of my fortune," said he, "to buy the diamonds and pearls for my eldest girls. I did not think I was doing any harm in plucking the poor little white rose for my youngest." The beast considered for a while, and then said, "I will pardon you on one condition, that is, that you will give me one of your daughters." "Oh!" exclaimed the merchant, "if I were so cruel as to buy my own life at the expense of one of my children, what excuse could I make to bring her here?" "No excuse is needed," answered the beast. "If she comes at all, she will come willingly. Let me see if any one of them will be brave enough, and loves you dearly enough, to come here and save your life. You seem to be an honest man. I give you a month in which to return home and propose to one of your daughters to come here to me. If none of them be willing, then I expect you, on your honour, to return here to your death. Say goodbye to them forever." The merchant reluctantly accepted this proposal. He did not think any of his daughters would come, but it reprieved him for 1 month, and gave him an opportunity of saying farewell to them, and of settling his affairs. He promised to return at the appointed time, and then asked permission to set off at once. But the beast would not allow this till the next day. "Then," said he, "you will find a horse ready for you. Go in and eat your dinner, and await my further orders." The poor merchant, more dead than alive, went back into the palace, and into the same room in which he had rested before. There he found a most delicious meal prepared for him. He was, however, in no mood to eat, and if he swallowed a few mouthfuls, it was only lest he should anger the beast by refusing all food from his table. When he had finished, he heard a trampling in the passages, and, shortly, the monstrous beast appeared, who repeated the terms of the agreement they had made, and he added, "Do not get up tomorrow until after sunrise, until you have heard a bell ring. Then you will find your breakfast prepared for you here, and the horse you are to ride will be ready in the courtyard. He will bring you back again when you come with your daughter a month hence. Farewell! Take a white rose for Beauty, and remember your engagement." The merchant was only too glad when the beast went away, and though he could not sleep for sadness of heart, yet he lay down on the couch. Next morning, after a hasty breakfast, he went to gather the rose for Beauty, mounted the horse, and rode swiftly away. The gloomy thoughts that weighed on his mind were not dispersed when he drew up at his cottage door. His daughters, who had been uneasy at his long absence, were prodigal of their embraces, and seeing him ride home on such a splendid horse, they felt quite sure that he had been successful in his journey. He gave his elder daughters the gems and pearls they had desired, and, as he handed the rose to Beauty, he sadly said, "You little know, my darling, what this has cost me." This saying greatly excited the curiosity of his children, and they gave him no rest till he had told them the whole story from beginning to end. The elder daughters urged him to break his promise and remain at the cottage, but their father said a promise was a promise, whether made to a king or a pauper, a man or a beast, and that he must fulfil it. Then the two eldest were very angry with Beauty, and told her that it was all her fault. If she had asked for something sensible, then this would not have happened. "If it be my fault," answered Beauty meekly, "it is only fitting that I should suffer for it. I will, therefore, go back with my father to the palace of the beast." At first her father would not hear of this, but Beauty was firm. As the time drew nearer, she divided all her little possessions between her sisters and said good-bye to all she loved. Now it must be told that when Beauty had received the white rose, she put it in water, and when she had heard how it was won, and what it entailed, she had wept nightly over it, and her tears falling on it seemed to have preserved it in its beauty, for at the end of the month it was as fresh as when first picked, and the scent was so sweet that it perfumed the whole house. She put the white rose in her bosom when the day came for her departure, and she mounted on a pillion behind her father to depart. The horse seemed to fly rather than gallop, and Beauty would have enjoyed the journey if it were not for the dreadful prospect of the beast at the end of it. Her father constantly urged her to dismount and turn back, but she would not hearken to this. At last they reached the avenue of orange trees, and then a wonderful sight was seen. Every orange was like a globe of light. The oranges were deep yellow, and the lemons pale yellow, and all shone like lamps. Moreover, beautiful lights played about the palace, and sweet music murmured among the trees. "The beast must be very hungry," said Beauty, "if he makes such rejoicing over getting such a little mouthful as myself." The horse now stopped at the foot of the flight of steps leading to the gate, and when she had dismounted, her father led her through the halls and galleries to the little room in which he had rested, and began regaled when there on his former visit. Again the fire was burning, and on the table a lavish supper was spread. The merchant knew that this was meant for them, and Beauty, who was rather less frightened now that she had passed through so many rooms without seeing the beast, was willing to begin, for her long ride had made her hungry. They had hardly finished eating before they heard tramp, tramp, stump, stump. It was the sound of the beast approaching, and Beauty clung to her father in terror, which was heightened when she saw how greatly alarmed he was. But when the beast entered, like a brave and a courteous girl, she stood up, mastered her fear, and making a low curtsy, she said, "I thank you, Mr. Beast, for my pretty white rose." Then the beast was pleased. He saw the little flower in her bosom, looking white and fresh as when first picked, and he said, somewhat gently, "Did you come quite willingly, Beauty?" "Yes, Mr. Beast," said Beauty, and dropped another curtsy. "And will you be willing to remain with me when your father is gone? I will not eat you. My food is only crystallized rose and violet leaves. I eat nothing more solid or less aesthetic." "Yes, Mr. Beast," answered Beauty, and the thought that she was not to be eaten revived her courage, and she dropped another little curtsy. "I am well pleased with you," said the beast. "You shall stay. As for you," he now turned to the merchant, "at sunrise tomorrow you must depart. When the bell rings, rise quickly and eat your breakfast, and you will find the same horse waiting to take you home. But remember, you must never venture to seek my palace again." Then, turning to Beauty, he said, "Take your father into the next room and help him to choose presents for your sisters. There are 2 portmanteaus there. Fill them with whatever you like to send home. All are yours and at your disposal." Then the beast made a clumsy bow and put his paw to his heart and said, "Goodbye, Beauty. Goodbye, merchant man." Beauty was very sorrowful to have to part with her father, and much dismayed at the thought of being left alone in the great palace with no one but the beast. However, she promptly obeyed his orders. The room they entered was full of the costliest objects, the most splendid dresses, and the richest jewellery. After making a selection, she put them in the portmanteau which she intended to contain the presents for her sisters. Then she found a trunk full of gold coins, and with them she stuffed the second portmanteau, which was for her father. But Beauty and her father much doubted whether the horse could carry the load. However, on reaching the courtyard, there they saw 2 horses beside that on which the merchant had ridden. They moved the portmanteaus down and strapped them on the pack horses' backs. Then the merchant bade his daughter a tender farewell with many tears, and rode away. Then Beauty wept bitterly, and wandered sadly back to the room in which she had eaten. She soon found herself so sleepy that she threw herself on the couch and closed her eyes, and was at once in the world of dreams. Now, in her dreams she saw something very strange. She thought that there stood before her a prince, handsomer than any man she had ever seen, wearing a crown of white roses on his head. He said to her, "Beauty, your fate is not as forlorn as you suppose. Be true-hearted as you are beautiful, and all will be well in the end." Beauty awoke, after a long sleep, much refreshed. She then began to explore the palace. The first room she entered was lined with looking-glasses, and Beauty saw herself reflected on every side. She then saw a bracelet hanging down from a chandelier. She took it, looked at it, and saw that it was hung a locket, and in this locket was the portrait of the very prince she had seen in her dream. The next room she entered was tapestried round with foliage, and it was full of musical instruments. Beauty knew how to play some of them, and she amused herself for some time trying them, and playing the different ballad tunes that came into her head. First she sang, "There was a fair maiden, all forlorn, with hey, with ho for the rain, and she sat herself down, all under a thorn, the poppies are red in the grain." Next she sang, "There rode a knight, when the moon shone bright, he rode to the lady's hall, he sang her a lay, bade her come away, and follow him at his call. He courted her many a long winter night, and many a short winter day, and he laid in wait, both early and late, for to take her sweet life away." Then she sang, "There came an earl a-riding by, a gipsy maid espied he. O nut-brown maid, to her he said, I prithee, come away with me. I take you up, I'll carry you home, I'll put a safeguard over you. Your slippers shall be of Spanish leather, and silken stockings all of blue." And last of all she sang, green gravel, the grass is so green, the fairest young damsel that ever was seen. O beauty, your true love is dead, he sends you a letter to turn round your head." Then Beauty was tired of singing and playing, and she went into the next room, which was a library, and it was full of books. She pulled down several and looked at them, and thought that surely it would take her all her life to read the books she saw there. Then she walked into the garden, and wondrous were the flowers and the fruit there. Never had she seen so many and such beautiful flowers, never had she tasted such delicious fruit. At last day declined, and she came indoors. A brilliant light illuminated all the rooms. She found supper prepared for her, and she seated herself to eat. Then she heard, tramp, tramp, stump, stump, and in came the Beast. He asked her if she thought she could be happy in his palace, and Beauty answered that everything was so beautiful that she would be very hard to please if she could not be happy. Then he asked if he might sit down and eat his meal with her. "Oh, what shall I say?" cried Beauty, for she knew that she could not eat in comfort with him munching crystallized rose leaves and violets out of a bonbon box on the other side of the table. "Say exactly what you think," he replied. "Oh, no, Beast," said Beauty hastily, "since you will not." "Good night, Beauty," he said, and she responded, "Good night, Beast." When she was asleep, she again dreamed of the mysterious prince. Next day she found a room in which were silks and canvas and needles and all sorts of articles for embroidery. Then she entered an aviary full of beautiful birds, which was so tame that they flew to Beauty as soon as they saw her and perched on her shoulder and hands. The day passed a little more heavily than the last, and Beauty began to long for someone to talk to, and even was pleased when at supper she heard the tramp, tramp, stump, stump of the Beast coming along the passages. She now put a chair on the side of the table opposite her, and when the Beast said, "May I sit down and eat with you, Beauty?" she answered, "Oh, please do, Beast." That night she dreamed of the prince again, and he smiled at her and looked pleased. Next day she walked in the woods, and she saw deer there, fleet and graceful, and she came on fish ponds in which were gold and silver fish. She went to the music room and tried to play and sing, but became tired of her loneliness, and wished greatly for supper, when the beast would appear, and she could talk with him and hear him talk. When day declined and the palace was lighted up for supper, then she waited impatiently for the tramp, tramp, stump, stump, and when the beast came in, she ran to meet him, dropped a curtsy, and said, "Please, beast, can you play and sing?" "Yes, Beauty." "Would you play and sing with me sometimes?" she asked. "Certainly, Beauty, if you wish it." Next day, when she entered the music room, the beast was there, and she found that not only could he play very charmingly on many instruments, but also could sing a rich bass. They made together quite a charming little concert, singing duets and playing different instruments, and this wore the morning away. In the afternoon, Beauty was quite dull by herself. She wandered in the library, looking at one book after another, and she could not choose which to read. So at supper, she ran along the gallery to meet the beast. Directly she heard his tramp, tramp, stump, stump, and, dropping a little curtsy, she said, "Please, beast, will you tell me what books to read?" "Certainly, Beauty," he answered, and next day she found him in the library, and he read with her, and explained to her difficult passages, and so a very pleasant morning was passed. In the afternoon, Beauty walked in the garden, admiring the flowers, and wishing that she knew their names. At supper, when she heard the tramp, tramp, stump, stump of the beast, she ran to meet him, and, taking one of his paws in her hand, said, "Please, beast, will you walk in the garden with me?" "Certainly, Beauty," he answered, and next day when she went into the garden, there he was, and he was able to tell her all about the flowers, their names and their properties, and whence they came. That evening, at supper, she said to the beast, "Please, beast, may I make you a pair of slippers?" "Certainly, Beauty," he answered, "but my feet are very big and clumsy." "Oh," said she, "not half so big and clumsy as those of an elephant." So she amused herself in embroidering for the beast a pair of slippers. The ground was turquoise blue, and on it were white roses with stamens of gold, and the pods for seed were scarlet. Never before or after were such beautiful slippers made. That night she dreamed that she saw the prince. He looked at her, smiling, and showed that he wore her slippers, which he had made for the beast, and they had shrunk to the size of his finely formed feet. One day she was in the forest, and she thought, "Oh, how nice it would be to ride out hunting, but how dull to ride all alone." So that evening at supper she ran to the beast, which she heard his tramp, tramp, stump, stump, and, catching hold of both his paws, she said, "Please, beast, will you go hunting with me?" "Certainly, Beauty," he answered. Next day there was a fine hunt, and Beauty enjoyed herself vastly. One day, when Beauty was walking in the garden with the beast, she passed with him by the hedge of white roses, and she put out her hand and picked one. Then he said to her, "Beauty, will you marry me? If so, give me the white rose." "Oh, what shall I say?" cried Beauty, for she was sorry to offend the beast, who had been so kind to her, and such an agreeable companion, and so eager to forestall all her wishes. But, at the same time, he was a beast. He said, seeing her hesitation, "Say just what you think." Then Beauty answered hastily, "Oh, no, beast." That night she dreamed of her prince, and that he looked sad and woebegone. So everything went on for a time, until at last, happy as she was, Beauty began to long for the sight of her father and sisters. One evening, seeing her look very sad, and her eyes red, the beast asked her what was the matter. Beauty had quite ceased to be afraid of him. She knew that he was gentle and kind in spite of his ferocious appearance, and clever and learned in spite of his being such an animal, and quite dainty and courteous in his manners, though a beast. She answered that she was longing to see her home once more. Upon hearing this, the beast seemed greatly affected. He sighed and said, "Ah, Beauty, will you desert your poor beast like this? Is it because you hate me that you want to leave me?" "No, dear beast," answered Beauty softly. "Indeed I do not hate you, and it would make me very unhappy if I thought I should never see and talk with you again. But I do long greatly to see my father. Let me go, if only for 2 months, and I promise to return to you and stay with you for the rest of my life." The beast said, I can refuse you nothing, and that you well know. Take the 4 boxes you will find in the room next your own, and fill them with whatever you like to take away with you. But remember your promise, and return when 2 months have expired, or you will find your faithful beast dead. You will not need any carriage to bring you back. Only say goodbye to your father and sisters the night before you come away. And then, in your room, turn this ring I give you on your finger and say, 'I wish to be with my beast again.'" As soon as Beauty was by herself, she hastened to fill the boxes with all the rare and precious things she saw about her. Then she went to bed, but could hardly sleep for joy. And when at last she did begin to dream of her beloved prince, she saw him lying stretched on the grass, sad and weeping. When she opened her eyes, she could hardly believe her senses. She was in a very different place from the palace of the beast. The room was neat and comfortable, but not splendid. Where could she be? She dressed herself hastily, and then saw that the boxes she had packed were in the room. While she was wondering where she was, she heard her father's voice. She at once left the room, and, seeing him, threw herself into his arms. She was, in fact, in the new house to which her father had removed from the cottage, when his fortunes were improved. Her sisters were greatly astonished to see her. All embraced her with demonstrations of the greatest joy, but her sisters were not in heart glad to see her. Their jealousy was not extinguished. She was made to tell her story, and it filled all with astonishment. But when she said that her stay with them was limited to 2 months, then her father was sorrowful, but her sisters secretly rejoiced. Her father had much to tell her, and her sisters had made many acquaintances, and the time was spent in going about making visits and in receiving company. Nevertheless, somehow, Beauty did not feel as happy as she had been with her beast. The time had come at last when she ought to return, but her father was so sorrowful when she spoke of departure, and there was always something arranged for the next day for which she was expected to remain, so that she did not fulfil her promise exactly. Besides, she so loved her father that she could not make up her mind to bid him good-bye. One night she had a dreadful dream. She thought she was back again in the beast's palace, and that she was walking through the room seeking him. Not finding him anywhere, she went into the garden and called him, but received no answer. At last, having reached a portion of the shrubberies that was allowed to run wild, she heard groans issuing from a cave. She penetrated into it, and found the beast prostrate on the ground, and apparently dying. He reproached her with having forgotten him and broken her promise, and reminded her of what he had said, that her absence protracted beyond the 2 months allotted to her would be death to him. Beauty was so terrified by this dream that she sprang from her bed, ran to her father's room, roused him, said farewell. Then she did the same to her sisters, and, still agitated with the thoughts of the dying beast, turned her ring and wished herself back in his palace. Hardly had she done this before she was again in the little chamber in which she had spent so many agreeable hours. She looked about. No beast was there. Then, although it was night, she ran out into the garden, calling him and seeking him. She was still searching for him when the grey of dawn appeared. Then she was able to find her way, and she sought the wilderness she had been in her dream, and at last lit on the cavern of which she had dreamed. In fact, from this now issued the most lamentable sighs and groans. She ran in and saw the poor beast stretched on the earth, and evidently exceedingly weak and suffering. "Oh, beast, beast!" she cried. "I am so sorry, so heartily sorry that I have delayed my return. Oh, tell me you will recover." "Nothing will restore me but one thing," he answered in a faint voice. "Tell me what that is, and it is yours." "The rose," he answered, "the white rose. You will find it growing over the mouth of this cave, but remember, if you give me that, you give me yourself with it. You accept me as your husband." In a moment, without speaking, Beauty sprang out of the cave, and hastily plucked a beautiful white rose that hung down over the mouth. Returning to the poor beast, she gave it to him, and said, "Dear beast, indeed I am yours. I love you with all my heart." "Will you kiss me on my snout?" asked the beast. "Indeed, indeed I will," answered Beauty. At that moment the sun rose and poured its golden beams into the cave, and made the walls glitter and twinkle like a cave of rainbow, and indeed they were all of ruby, carbuncle, amethyst, topaz, emerald, and every imaginable stone. The reflection was so dazzling that Beauty, having kissed the beast, covered her eyes. When she drew her hands away, he had disappeared. In his place stood her long-dreamed-of beautiful prince. Then he took her by the hand and said, "Dear Beauty, to you, to your faithfulness and goodness, I owe my delivery. I have been bewitched by a cruel fairy, who said I should remain in the form of a hideous monster until some maiden would consent to be my wife, and in token of her consent give me a white rose and kiss me on the mouth. This is my palace. I have an immense kingdom and innumerable treasures. You shall be my queen, and we will make your father happy, and, if possible, your sisters shall be made contented. I shall never forget what you have done for me, and all my life shall be devoted to rendering you happy." Notes on Beauty and the Beast. One of Madame de Beaumont's tales, and it is the only one of hers that has lived, and it has lived for one reason only, that it is not an original creation of her brain, but is based on a universally known myth of a woman, loving and consenting to union with a transformed prince who has a monstrous shape. Very generally the sexes are reversed, and the young lady is transformed into a serpent or a dragon. I know a certain precipice in the Montefontau in the Alps, where a maiden changed into the form of a monstrous toad, with poison dribbling from her lips, was said to be doomed to squat in a cave till a youth would kiss her on the mouth. End of section 10.
Section 11 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. The Yellow Dwarf. Once upon a time there lived a queen who had an only daughter, whom she loved so excessively that she never corrected her faults or thwarted her wishes. The consequence of this folly was, the young lady grew up very self-willed and unamiable. Her great beauty made her likewise very proud. She was called All Fair, and the fame of her beauty spread through all the surrounding courts, and many princes became so enamored as to offer her marriage. But the princess rejected them all, much to the annoyance of the queen her mother, who was very anxious to see her daughter well married. When she found all her entreaties were of no avail, she resolved to go and consult the Fairy of the Desert respecting the best course to be adopted towards her stubborn daughter. It was, however, difficult to gain access to this fairy, for she was guarded by 2 fierce lions. The queen, however, knew of a certain cake that would appease their fury and enable her to pass by them. Providing herself with this, she set out privately towards the fairy's dwelling. After walking several miles, she became so excessively weary that she lay down under a tree and fell into a sound sleep. Suddenly she was awoke by the roaring of the lions, who were approaching her. She jumped up and seized her basket of cakes to appease their fury, but alas, it was empty. The poor queen was in an agony of terror, not knowing what to do. It was impossible to escape from the furious lions, and there appeared no other prospect for her than a cruel death. At this moment she heard a noise in the tree which attracted her attention, and on looking up she saw an ugly yellow dwarf, about 3 feet high, picking oranges. "Ah, Queen," said he, "you are in great danger. These lions have destroyed many, and how will you escape, seeing you have no cakes?" "Alas," said the Queen, weeping, "I know not, for I have lost my cakes." "There is but one way," replied the dwarf. "I know what has brought you here, and if you will promise me your daughter in marriage, I will save you from the lions. If not, they shall devour you." The Queen, horrified at the thought of sacrificing her beautiful daughter to such a hideous creature, made him no answer, but a terrible growl from the lions, who were just ready to spring upon her, so terrified her that she gave her promise and then fainted away. When the Queen came to herself, she was in bed in her own palace. All that had passed seemed as a dream. Nevertheless, she was so persuaded of its reality that her spirits gave way, and she sank into such a state of melancholy that she cared for nothing. Princess Allfair loved her mother very tenderly, and she grieved to see her in such a state of dejection. After trying in vain to ascertain the cause of the Queen's sorrow, that she might comfort her, the Princess determined on paying a visit to the Fairy of the Desert, to ask her advice on the subject. All-Fair, having provided some cakes for the lions, started secretly on her dangerous journey. It so happened that she took the same road as her mother had taken, and accordingly arrived at the unlucky orange tree. Attracted by the luscious appearance of the oranges, she put down her basket and plucked some to eat. Whilst the Princess was enjoying the fruit, she heard the roaring of the lions, which were advancing towards her. Alarmed at this terrible sight, she hastily picked up the basket to take out some cakes, but she found to her great sorrow that the basket was empty. All-Fair, overwhelmed with terror, wrung her hands and sobbed aloud. The hideous Yellow Dwarf now made his appearance, and asked the Princess what had brought her to that place. She told him she was going to consult the Fairy of the Desert as to the cause of her mother's sorrow. "Oh," replied he, "you need not go any farther to ascertain that. I can tell you the cause. She has promised you to me in marriage, and now is so ungrateful as to repent of her promise." "What!" exclaimed the Princess. "The Queen, my mother, promised me to such a hideous creature as you? Impossible!" "Oh, very well," replied the Yellow Dwarf. "As you please, young lady. The lions will soon punish you for your insolence." The lions were about to seize on poor All-Fair, when she cried to the dwarf, "Oh, save me, and I will promise to marry you, rather than be eaten by these monsters." On saying these words she fainted from terror. When she recovered from her swoon, she found herself in her own apartment, and round one of her fingers was a ring of red hair, so tightly fastened that she could not remove it. The Princess now became as melancholy as her mother. The Queen and all her court were greatly distressed at the alteration in the Princess, and they concluded that the most likely way of diverting her thoughts would be by urging her to marry. The Princess listened to their proposals, and at length consented to marry the King of the Golden Mines, who had long tried to gain her affections. This king was exceedingly rich and powerful. When all was agreed upon, preparations were made to celebrate the nuptials in the most magnificent style. The King of the Golden Mines expended large sums of money in purchasing all that was splendid and gorgeous, and the palace glittered with gold and precious stones. At length the day arrived for the celebration of the marriage, but as the party were proceeding to perform the ceremony, they saw an ugly old fairy approaching them, riding on a box drawn by two peacocks. Coming up to the Queen, she shook her crutch in a malicious manner, saying, "Oh, oh, this is the way you perform the promise you made to my friend the Yellow Dwarf? I am the Fairy of the Desert, and I will not allow such unfaithfulness to my friend to go unpunished. Therefore, decide whether you will marry him or die." This unexpected appearance of the fairy filled the Queen and Princess with the greatest alarm. But the King of the Golden Mines drew his sword, and going up to the fairy, he said, "Fly, wretch, or I will strike off thy head." The King had no sooner uttered these words than the box flew open, and out started the Yellow Dwarf, seated on a huge wild cat, who, placing himself before the fairy, said, "Hold, rash youth! Your rage must be vented against me. I am your rival and enemy. I claim the Princess, who is pledged to me by the ring of hair on her finger." "Hideous monster!" exclaimed the Prince. "You are too contemptible to be noticed by me." The dwarf, enraged at this scornful speech, drew his sword and challenged the King to fight. Immediately the air was darkened, and amidst lightnings and thunder the two peacocks were transformed into giants of enormous size, who stood on each side of the Yellow Dwarf, vomiting fire. All the spectators were terrified at this fearful sight, excepting the King of the Gold Mines, who with undaunted courage attacked his terrible enemy. But his brave heart sank within him when he saw the Fairy of the Desert, mounted on a fiery dragon, advance toward his beloved All-Fair and strike her to the ground. The King hastened to the assistance of his lady, but the dwarf, flying before him on his cat, seized All-Fair and carried her off. The fairy, having fallen in love with the king, carried him aloft in the air, and conveyed him to a frightful cavern and chained him up, hoping thus to make him forget all fair and secure him for herself. But finding this plan unsuccessful, she changed herself into a lovely girl, and going to the king, she removed his fetters and placed him by her side in a chariot drawn by swans, which flew rapidly through the air. In their flight they passed over a palace of polished steel, the brilliance of which attracted the king's notice, and on looking down he saw All Fair weeping bitterly in the garden. The princess, attracted by a noise in the sky, looked up and saw to her great sorrow the king of the gold mines, seated in the chariot with the fairy. Stung to the heart at this sight, she inwardly reproached the king with want of fidelity to herself, and piteously bewailed her unhappy condition. The poor king still loved her terribly, and would have rejoiced, if he could, to have thrown the fairy from the chariot and hastened to her rescue. But the chariot passed swiftly on until they approached a magnificent palace on the sea coast, at which the swans descended. The fairy then alighted and led the king into the palace, in which was everything that could delight the eye. The king knew that his companion was a fairy, and he suspected she was the fairy of the desert, although she appeared as a lovely young woman. He resolved, therefore, to ingratiate himself with her if possible, and to conceal his dislike of her, in the hope that he might have some opportunity of escaping. The fairy, supposing her charms had now made some impression upon the prince, allowed him to walk beyond the gardens of the palace. One day, as he was walking by the seashore, he was surprised by the appearance of a mermaid, which spake to him in a melodious voice, and said, "I am aware, O king, of the attachment existing between you and Princess Allfair. I know also the misery you endure, and am come to release you from it. I am an enemy to the fairy of the desert and the yellow dwarf. If you therefore will trust to me, I will deliver you and the princess out of their power." The king gratefully accepted the proffered aid, and seating himself on the mermaid's back, promised to do all that she should direct. They then sailed off, and as they went, the mermaid told him all that had befallen the princess, and that she was now confined in the steel castle of the dwarf. At length they drew near to the place, when the mermaid told him that he would have many powerful enemies to overcome before he could reach his beloved princess. "But," said she, "if you take this sword," which she then gave him, "and follow my directions, you will be able to destroy them all. Beware lest the sword fall from your hand, for if you once lose possession of it, you will not be able to recover it, and certain destruction will fall upon you." The king promised to use the utmost caution, and after warmly thanking the mermaid for her kind services, he started for the castle. The first danger he encountered was two enormous lions, which guarded the outer gate. He advanced boldly towards them, and with one blow laid them dead at his feet. On reaching the inner court, the king was assailed by 6 fierce dragons of prodigious size, but he quickly destroyed them with his magic sword. The king then entered the castle, and was met by a band of lovely females, who forbade his entering, telling him that they were appointed to guard the castle, and that their lives would be forfeited if they allowed any person to enter. The king was so moved by their entreaties that he could not resist them, until he heard a voice say, "Strike, or the princess is forever lost." He now saw this was a cunning trick of the dwarf to ensnare him, and without hesitation he attacked and scattered them. The king then advanced to the place where he had seen the princess, and throwing himself at her feet, he declared his unalterable love for her. The princess drew herself from him and said, "Did I not see you riding with the fairy of the desert? Is that your fidelity and love?" The king related to her all the circumstances, and while talking he thoughtlessly dropped the magic sword, which the yellow dwarf, seeing from behind a bush, sprung forward and seized. "Now," said he, "you are in my power, and unless you consent to give up the princess to me, I will at once destroy you." The king replied, "No, never will I do that. I scorn the terms you propose." The malicious dwarf immediately struck off his head. This dreadful spectacle broke the heart of the poor princess, and she fell upon the body of her beloved and died. The kind mermaid grieved over the fate of these faithful lovers, and resolving to unite in death those who were so cruelly separated in life, she transformed them into two trees, which grew side by side and intertwined their branches. Notes. The Yellow Dwarf. One of the Countess d'Aulnoy's tales. At bottom this is the same story as Grimm's Rumpelstiltskin, which is a very old one, and is referred to by Fischart in his Gargantua, 1575. Mademoiselle d'Aulnoy spoiled a good story. All the portions of it relative to the King of the Gold Mines is her addition. The fact was that she did not understand the significance of the task set to discover the name of the dwarf, and so she cut that away and substituted some trash of her own for it. The result has been that a good folk tale has suffered, and that the Yellow Dwarf has never attained the popularity of some of her other tales, in which she has more faithfully followed tradition. The demand of the dwarf for the Queen's daughter enters into a whole string of fairy tales, and refers back to the date when the fair-haired Gaul, or Briton, or Teuton, had overcome the dusty Ugric race which had occupied the land previously. Marriage was strictly forbidden between the conquerors and the conquered, but the Ugric autochthones were regarded as invested with supernatural powers and with superior skill in the working of metals, and when they rendered services to their conquerors, often demanded in recompense one of their daughters in marriage. I have not rewritten the Yellow Dwarf. I could not endure to do this, so dissatisfied do I feel with Mademoiselle d'Aulnoy for having spoiled a good story. Let anyone compare this version with Grimm's Rumpelstiltskin, and he will see at once the immeasurable superiority of the latter. I myself read both as a child, and I have never forgotten Rumpelstiltskin, and I never have been able to recall the Yellow Dwarf. End of section 11.
Section 12 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Hop o' my Thumb. As it fell upon a day, there lived a woodcutter and his wife on the outskirts of a great forest. They had 7 children, and all were boys. The eldest was 10, and the youngest 7 years old. The parents were very poor, and the children were nearly the same age, for they were twins, with the exception of the youngest, and unable to earn their bread. The father was sore puzzled how to provide for them. What made matters worse was that the youngest was very sickly and weak. When he was born, he was but the size of a man's thumb, and this made his father call him Hop o' my Thumb. This poor child bore the blame of whatever went amiss in the house. He was always thought to be in the wrong. He was, however, far more clever than was supposed. Indeed, he had more sense in his little noddle than in all those of his brothers put together. He spoke very little, but then he kept his ears wide open. Just as Hop o' my Thumb had reached his 7th year, the land was afflicted with a great famine, and food became so dear that the woodcutter and his wife found great difficulty in getting even dry bread for their family. At last they spent their last penny, and knew that when they had finished the loaf that was then in the house, they must starve. Very sad and wretched were the pair that evening as they sat over the wood fire, thinking of what awaited them. The children had been long in bed, and were, as the parents thought, asleep, and knew nothing of the miseries of the coming day. "My dear wife," said the woodcutter, breaking a long silence, and his voice sounded hoarse and hollow. "My dear wife, I have something to say to you. I cannot bear to see our poor dear children die of the slow pangs of hunger. I think we had better take them into the forest tomorrow and leave them there. It is possible that the fairies may take pity on their innocence and helplessness, and carry them off to live with them. At any rate, we shall be spared seeing them die, and hearing their cries for food. "Oh, husband," said the poor startled woman, "how can you think of so dreadful a deed? Have you forgotten that the wolves which haunt the woods would be much more likely to eat the poor babes up than the fairies to feed them? Oh, no, no! I will never consent." But the husband was a man who, when once he had resolved on a thing, was not easily turned from his purpose. So he talked and argued and scolded his poor wife till he made her give an unwilling consent to his proposal.
"Heaven, you see, has left us to starve,"
he said.
"Therefore we need not care what we do, or what becomes of us."
These were foolish and wicked words. Heaven never forgets us, and the woodcutter ought to have been patient and have waited till help came, or else he should have died bravely without daring to do wrong. But he had lived very long in the forest, and had not been taught what is right and what is wrong. Weeping very bitterly, the wife at last went to bed, and soon after her husband followed. As he closed the door of the room behind him, you might have seen a little dark object creep out from under the bench on which the woodcutter and his wife had been sitting. This was none other than Hop-o'-my-Thumb. He fixed his sharp little eyes on the red embers, and seemed lost in thought. Then he nodded his head, and he crept out of the room into a large closet, where he and his brothers slept. Hop-o'-my-Thumb had not intended to listen to what his parents were saying. He had been very cold in bed from hunger, and having found that the warmth of the fire made him feel better, he had stolen softly under the bench, meaning to give himself a good warming before he went to sleep. But when he heard his father's resolve to leave them in the wood, he was afraid to let him know that he was there, and scarcely dared breathe till his father and mother were gone to bed. As you may suppose, Hop-o'-my-Thumb slept little that night. He was glad when he saw the dawn peep in at the window. Then he rose, without waking his brothers, and went down to the brook near the hut, and filled his pockets with smooth round pebbles, as white as snow. By and by the woodcutter called out in a cheerful voice,
"Get up, my little sons, and come with me into the wood. I will give you a treat. You shall help me to bind the faggots."
Now the little boys very much liked to help their father, feeling proud to be useful. "And I will go with you," said the mother, though she gave a deep sigh as she spoke. They each had a slice of bread for breakfast, and then they all set out for the forest. That morning was lovely. The leaves were glistening with dew, and the birds were singing on the branches. Everything looked fresh, and Hop-o'-my-Thumb could hardly believe that anyone could be so cruel as his father and mother intended to be. But he took care as he went along to drop the pebbles, and no one noticed what he did. The trees gradually closed in, so that they had to walk separately, and about 10 feet apart, and thus they followed each other in a long line, the youngest coming last. When the thicket opened a little, the woodcutter began his work, and the children helped him, picking up the smaller branches and binding them into faggots. Hop-o'-my-Thumb did the same. Whilst they were thus employed, the parents stole away unperceived, and as soon as they were out of sight, hurried to their house, leaving their poor little boys alone in the forest. By and by the sun went down, and Peter, the eldest boy, cried, "Father and mother, where are you? It is growing dark. Is it not time to go home?" But no voice answered him, only the echo cried, "Home, home," mocking them. The little boys ran hither and thither, calling on their parents, and at last, finding that they were left alone, they all huddled into a group, with their arms round each other, and began to cry. Then Hop-o'-my-Thumb spoke. "Do not cry, brothers, for I can show you the way home." The little boys were glad when they heard him say this, and they crowded round him, asking eagerly why their father and mother had left them. Then Hop-o'-my-Thumb told his brothers all that he had overheard. "But do not fear," he added. "I have strewn white pebbles all the way we came, and these will guide us out of the forest. Only we must set out at once, before the darkness falls." So holding on to each other, the little string of children followed Hop o' My Thumb, who looked for the pebbles which he had thrown behind him as he came along in the morning. The moon was shining, and by its light the pebbles glistened as snow, so that by their aid all safely reached the door of the woodman's hut. There, however, they paused, afraid to go in, since they knew that their parents wished them dead. Meanwhile, the woodcutter and his sorrowful wife had reached their dwelling before sunset, and had scarcely entered the room, where no sounds of little feet would, they believed, ever be heard again, than they were struck with remorse and horror. Before either of them could speak, they heard a cheerful voice at the door.
"Here, you, woodman!"
it cried.
"I have brought you help in time of need. The squire is sorry for the distress you are in, and has sent you some rabbits. A good many, too, because he knows you have a large family. Give those who have children the largest share, he said to me this morning. So there, you have 7 times as much as your neighbors."
The woodcutter turned pale and trembled as he heard those words. Here was help come, chiefly for the sake of the children, and he had cast them forth to perish. He could scarcely find voice to thank the forester for the gift. The good-natured fellow thought that his husky accents came from want, and nodding good-naturedly, he said, "Aye, I'll thank my master for you. Now, goody, make haste and cook your goodman some food, for he looks half-starved." Then he hurried away to carry help to another suffering family. You may imagine that the pair had little appetite for the supper thus sent to them. "Oh," cried the wife, if only our babes were here to partake of this good food! But no, the wolves are devouring them. My pretty ones will be eaten up in the lonely forest." And she gave herself up to passionate grief, threw herself on the floor, and would not be comforted. Meantime her husband, though feeling very miserable, made up the fire and began to roast a pair of rabbits. When ready, he bade his wife come and eat some of the food. "No, no," she cried, "I will not eat it. I want my children. Where are my darling babes?" "Here we are, mother," cried 7 little voices all at once outside the door, and with a cry of delight the woman opened it, and saw her sons hand in hand standing close to it. She clasped them in her arms, and wept and laughed, and kissed them, as if she were mad with joy, and then she drew them in, and washed their faces and hands, and made them sit down, and fed them from her own plate, before she would taste a morsel herself. As to her husband, he also was very glad. Whilst the supply of rabbits lasted, they lived very comfortably and merrily, and the little boys, when seated by the fire, would often repeat how wise Hop o' My Thumb had been to strew pebbles along the way, and thus the father learned how his plan had been defeated. But the famine grew worse and worse, and the lord of the manor could no longer supply his tenants with food, for all the rabbits in his warren and in the woods had been killed and eaten. The woodcutter again grew morose, and once more determined to take his boys into the wood and there lose them. But as he was sure his wife would never consent to this, he persuaded her one day to go into the nearest town and beg for help, and while she was away he again told his sons to accompany him. But this time he watched Hop o' My Thumb, and took care that the child did not get any pebbles. However, as he gave each boy a slice of bread, poor Hop o' My Thumb thought that would do as well, and as he walked he took care to throw crumbs of bread all along the pathway. By and by the father proposed a game of hide-and-seek amongst the trees, and as the children played at it, he managed to slip away and leave them alone in the forest. When they were tired of play and found that their father had once more deserted them, they began to cry bitterly, but Hop o' My Thumb said, "Do not weep, my dear brothers. I will take you home." And he began to look for the path, by the crumbs of bread. Alas, the birds had eaten them all up. Hop-o'-my-Thumb did not, however, despair.
"My dear brothers," he said, "we were protected before. We shall not be deserted now. Do not let us waste the short time of twilight in tears, but hurry on and see if we can find a shelter for the night."
They all said they would do whatever he told them, for they saw that he was wiser than they were. So Hop-o'-my-Thumb led the way, and they endeavored to find a beaten track. But now night closed in, and a high wind raged in the forest. The trees creaked and groaned, till the terrified children expected to be beaten or crushed by their mighty boughs. Every now and then they heard in the distance the howl of the wolves. A heavy rain poured down and soaked their thin garments. Their feet slipped in the mire, and they fell repeatedly. At last Hop-o'-my-Thumb climbed to the top of a high tree. From this height he could look all around, and he perceived a light in the distance. He took notice in which direction it lay, descended to the ground, and led his brothers in the way that led to it. However, it was long before they could see the light as they trudged along, and they were beginning to despair, when they came suddenly on it, and found that it proceeded from a large house on the outskirts of the wood. They knocked at the door at once, and it was opened by a good-natured looking woman, who asked what they wanted. Hop-o'-my-Thumb told her that they were poor children who had lost their way in the forest, and begged that she would take pity on them and give them a night's lodging. The good woman, seeing these 7 poor little babes, with their long hair wet and draggled, hanging round their sweet faces, and their soft imploring eyes, wept for pity, and answered, "Ah, my poor darlings, you do not know whither you are come. This is the house of an ogre, who eats little children."
"Alas, madam," said Hop-o'-my-Thumb, "what shall we do? If you do not give us a night's shelter, the wolves will devour us, and sooner than that we should prefer to be eaten by the ogre. But perhaps you will have pity upon us, and spare our lives at your entreaty."
The ogre's wife, who hoped that she might be able to hide them from her husband till the next day, yielded to the children's entreaties, and let them in. She told them to sit down and warm themselves by the fire, which was large enough to roast a whole sheep for the ogre's supper. Now she was the giant's second wife. He had killed her father and mother, and had carried her off against her will. Just as they were beginning to get warm, they heard a loud knocking at the door.
"Here comes my husband," said the woman in a whisper. "Make haste, and let me hide you."
And she concealed them as well as she could under the bed. But it is difficult to conceal 7 boys. Then she went and admitted her husband. The ogre asked if his supper were ready, and his wine drawn, and immediately seated himself at the table. The sheep was served at once. It was still half raw, but he liked it all the better. When he had eaten it, he looked about him, and spied a little shoe lying near the fire.
"What is this?"
he asked in a terrible voice.
"You have had children by the fireside. Where are they?"
"Husband, how can you be so silly?" said the poor trembling wife. "Surely that is only our eldest daughter's doll's shoe." The giant might have been deceived, but just at that moment poor Peter, who had caught a cold, happened to sneeze. With a savage roar the ogre jumped up and dragged the 7 pretty children from under the bed, where they were hidden.
"Ah!"
said he to his wife.
"This is the way you deceive me, is it? It would serve you right if I were to eat you, but you are serviceable to me. You do my cooking. However, these children come just as I wanted them. 3 ogres are coming to dine with me the day after tomorrow, and they will greatly enjoy such a feast. The children may not be fat, but they are tender."
The poor boys cast themselves at the ogre's feet, and, with many tears, besought him to spare them. But they had fallen into the power of the most cruel of the ogres, who had no pity. He answered their prayers by telling his wife that he would have them roasted and served up with applesauce. He then got his axe and was about to cut off their heads, when his wife said, "It would be better to keep them for a day or two, and feed them up,
for as you see they are half-starved and terribly thin."
The giant took up Hop-o'-my-Thumb and pinched his arms. "You're right," he said. "They must be fattened. This child is nothing but skin and bone."
So their long want of food saved their lives for the nonce. Then the woman, with real pleasure, but as if to oblige her husband, brought them a good supper, and coaxed them to eat, and they were so hungry that they were glad to do so, although they were trembling with fear. Meantime the ogre sat down to the table, and, being very merry at the thought of the delicate dinner he would give his friends, he drank a great deal of wine, more by a dozen glasses than usual, and thus he grew so tipsy that he was obliged to go to bed early. Then the good woman put the 7 little boys to bed in the same room with the giant's own daughters by his first wife, who was dead, and they were just about their ages. These 7 little ogresses had very white skins, small eyes, and little noses and mouths, like other children, but they had long and sharp teeth, far apart. Though they were too young to do much mischief, they were as cruel as their father, and would bite pieces out of little children whenever they could get at them. The ogresses had been in bed some time and were fast asleep. They lay side by side in a big bed. Each of them wore a golden crown on her head. The ogre's wife put a nightcap on each of the boys. Now, Hop-o'-my-Thumb was afraid that the giant might change his mind and kill them in the night. So, as soon as the good woman was gone, he took off the gold crowns from the heads of the little ogresses and put them on his brothers and himself. And he set the nightcaps on the little girls' heads. This was a very wise proceeding. The ogre was so tipsy that he could not sleep, and as he lay thinking of the nice meal his guests would make, he forgot all about the fattening up, and determined to kill the boys and have them cooked for his breakfast. So he got out of bed, took his axe, and went to their room in the dark. Then he felt the beds, and finding the crowns on the boys' heads, he took them for his daughters, left them, and went to the other bed, and cut off the heads of the young ogresses. Satisfied with what he had done, he went back to bed, not knowing, of course, what a mistake he had made. As soon as Hop-o'-my-Thumb heard the ogre snoring, he awakened his brothers and told them to make haste and dress and follow him. They obeyed, and Hop-o'-my-Thumb stole with them downstairs, and opened the back door without making the least noise. Then they climbed over the garden wall and got into the road. They ran as fast as they could all night, not knowing which way they went. When the ogre awakened in the morning, he said to his wife,
"Go upstairs and dress those 7 boys for breakfast."
The wife was delighted to hear him speak, as she thought so kindly, for she had no idea that he meant cook by dress, but believed that he wished her to put on the little boys' clothes for them. So she ran upstairs. But when she entered the bedroom she was horror-struck to find that her 7 stepdaughters had all lost their heads. She gave a scream and fainted away. The ogre, who thought his wife had been gone a long time, at last went in search of her, and when he saw what had happened he was full of rage. He shouted till he had brought his wife to her senses. Then the weeping woman said, "Husband, if you had not been so cruel, this would never have happened."
"It is all the fault of those imps of boys," roared the giant. "They stole my daughter's crowns and put their nightcaps on my daughters' heads. I will follow them and punish them. Go fetch me my 7-league boots."
The woman obeyed, and the ogre, having put on his 7-league boots, sallied forth and strode over the country in search of the children. But Hop-o'-my-Thumb was on the watch, perched at the top of a poplar tree, and when he saw the giant stalking over mountains and crossing rivers at a single step, he descended, and said to his brothers, "Let us hide in this hole under a rock." He had observed the cavity before, and when his brothers were all inside it, he covered it with stones and boughs, and then hid himself under a dock leaf, for he was sure the giant would not find so small a being as himself. The ogre, who had been striding about in all directions, was now tired with his journey,
and felt inclined to rest. It so chanced that he lay down close by the very spot where the 7 children were concealed. As he was much exhausted by going about the country searching for the boys, and in every direction but the right one, he soon fell asleep, and began to snore so loud that the little fugitives were terribly frightened. But Hop-o'-my-Thumb drew his brothers gently out of the hollow, and bade them make haste home while the giant slept, and not trouble themselves about him. When they were gone, Hop-o'-my-Thumb crept quietly to the ogre, and gently drew off his boots and put them on his own legs. The 7-league boots were fairy boots, and would adapt themselves to any size of foot. Consequently, they suited Hop-o'-my-Thumb exactly, and he set out in them at once. But as he was quite sure that the giant would pursue him in order to recover them, he did not take the road homewards, but went off in an opposite direction. As he had expected, the giant woke up a few minutes afterwards, and, finding his wonderful boots gone, was in a towering passion. He looked about for them, and finding the trace of the huge heel, he at once pursued Hop-o'-my-Thumb. But what chance had his bare feet against the 7-league boots? Hop-o'-my-Thumb, looking back, beheld the giant blinded by his fury striding over a precipice. He saw that the ogre missed his footing, and fell crashing down to the bottom. The rocks echoed with the noise of his fall, as his huge form dashed from crag to crag, and Hop-o'-my-Thumb held his breath with awe.
"Poor children have reason to be glad you are gone," thought the boy, "and I dare say your kind wife will not be sorry."
Hop-o'-my-Thumb was now both tired and hungry, so he made haste to lead his brothers home. The very day after the father had left his children in the wood, the forester again called at the cottage. This time he brought some flour and half a pig, the lord of the manor having sold some land to buy food for his people. He was surprised to find only the wife at home, and she crying bitterly. "Why, good wife, where are all your children?" he asked. "And where's my little friend Hop-o'-my-Thumb, of whom my lord is quite fond?" The bereaved mother answered only by a burst of tears. Then the man, suspecting that something was wrong, insisted on knowing the truth, and the broken-hearted woman confessed all. The forester was much shocked. He set off at once for the village, called together the neighbors, and went and took both the woodcutter and his wife prisoners. So when the 6 brothers returned home with Hop-o'-my-Thumb, they found nobody in the woodman's hut. However, in the excitement of the moment, the villagers had left the bacon and flour in the cupboard, and so Hop-o'-my-Thumb said,
"Let us get some food while we can."
And he made a fire, cut rashers off the bacon, made a few cakes of flour and water, which he baked in the oven, and gave his brothers a good dinner. They were much surprised when night came and still their parents were absent, but they shut up the house, said their prayers, and went to bed, hoping that father and mother would soon return and tell them what they had better do. However, as they did not come, the boys resolved to stay a little longer at home, and, as they had plenty of food, they managed to live very comfortably. Meantime, in his dreary prison, the woodcutter had time to reflect on his crime. His wife never ceased reproaching him for it. "What do you think," she would say, "will be the judgment of our good squire on you?" The husband had not a word to answer. Indeed, he was so unhappy that he rather wished to be well punished. At last the boys became seriously alarmed at the absence of their parents.
"Ah, Hop-o'-my-Thumb, and we used to despise you," said the eldest brother. "We see now how mistaken we were. Can you help us now to the sight of father and mother?" "Well, I shall go into the village tomorrow and find out where they are," said Hop-o'-my-Thumb. Then they sat chatting and laughing round a wood fire, which danced and crackled as if it, too, were glad, and cast a ruddy glow upon the 7 little happy faces laughing round it. The next morning, early, Hop-o'-my-Thumb put on his 7-league boots, and was in the village in a moment, for it was only 10 miles off. He found it in a great state of commotion,
The people were gathered together on the village green, talking all at once. So Hop-o'-my-Thumb went up to them, and asked a woman what was the matter. "Oh, my little dear," said she. She was a stranger, and did not know Hop-o'-my-Thumb. "Oh, my dear, the squire has just held a court, and condemned a cruel woodcutter and his wife to death. The wicked people had cast forth 7 innocent babes to be eaten by the wolves." "Ah," thought Hop-o'-my-Thumb, "those are my father and mother. I am only just in time." So he stepped home again, and said to his brothers, "Make haste and walk as fast as you can to the village, and show the squire that we are yet alive." So the 6 brothers set out, and walked as fast as their little feet could carry them. Then Hop-o'-my-Thumb, taking them by the hand, led the little string of boys to the house of the forester, who was greatly astonished to see them alive and well. Hop-o'-my-Thumb related his adventures, and the forester insisted on taking them to the squire, who listened to their story with great interest. Of course, as the children were not dead, the woodcutter and his wife were not put to death, but the squire, though he restored the mother to her children, kept the father in prison for 2 months as punishment. Then the squire sent some of his soldiers, conducted by Hop-o'-my-Thumb, to the ogre's house to see what had become of his wife. They found that she had gone away to her kinsfolk in the country whence the ogre had carried her off, and the squire, on whose land the dwelling stood, at once bestowed it and all the ogre's wealth on Hop-o'-my-Thumb. So Hop-o'-my-Thumb took up his abode in that once dreaded house, and lived there with his father, his mother, and his brothers. His 7-league boots made them all rich, for whenever anyone wished to send letters or make inquiries at a distance, they sent to Hop-o'-my-Thumb, and asked him to go for them, and as he was paid a large sum for every journey, or we may say step, he took, he became a very wealthy man. Note: one of Perrault's tales. It is a version of the story which appears in its earliest forms in the Odyssey of Ulysses and Polyphemus. Grimm, in his Die Saga von Polyphem, Berlin, 1857, has given 11 variants. In Henderson's Northern Folklore, 2nd edition, 1879, pages 195 to 196, is a Yorkshire variant I picked up near Thirsk, where the giant's grave was pointed out, and the mill in which the giant was killed, and where also the sword was shown with which the giant was killed. Recently, the tumulus has been destroyed. It contained a prehistoric stone kist, probably of the Neolithic age, along with bones, so that the burial was before incineration took place. Moreover, it was an oblong barrow and not circular. Unhappily, no person of education was present when the tumulus was demolished. End of section 12.
Section 13 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Whittington and His Cat. A merchant once upon a time, who had great store of gold, among his household placed a boy, sore pinched by want and cold. No father and no mother watched with love o'er this poor boy, whose dearest treasure was a cat, his pet and only joy. They came to him beseechingly, when death was at the door, and kindly, to relieve her wants, he shared his little store. This boy was called Richard Whittington. He had lost his father and mother, and having no friends, had come up to London to seek his fortune. London streets, he had been told, were paved with gold. Alas, he found them only deep in mud and hard, hard with stones. After many privations and disappointments, and when nearly starved, he was taken into the house of a merchant named Fitzwarren. In this house he would have lived very happily if it had not been for the cook, who was very ill-natured, and who would beat him with the broom, and make him turn the spit on which was the roast meat like a dog. He was given a room in the garret in which to sleep, which was overrun with rats and mice. But Dick had brought up from his country town with him his dear cat, and this cat soon drove away the tormentors. A grateful cat, no mice might live where she put up to dwell, and Whittington could sweetly sleep while puss watched o'er his cell. Now it happened that soon after this the merchant, Mr. Fitzwarren, had a ship ready to sail with various commodities, which were to be sold or exchanged for others, whereby he would gain great profit. Now it was customary at that time for a master to ask his servants if they would like to venture their little savings in the same vessel, and so give them a chance of turning their money over and increasing their little stores. Now all the servants in Mr. Fitzwarren's house gave up something to embark in the venture, and the master asked Dick Whittington what he would put into the ship. But poor Dick had nothing save his pussy-cat, and rather than not have some share in the venture, but with tears in his eyes, he gave up his cat, at the advice of Alice, the merchant's daughter. So says the ballad. Now by the strand a gallant ship lay ready to set sail, when spoke the merchant, "Ho, prepare to catch the favouring gale. And each who will his fortune try, haste get your goods on board. The gains ye all shall share with me, whate'er they may afford." From distant lands, where precious musks and jewels rare are found, what joy to waft across the seas their spoils to English ground. So hasted then each one on board with what he best could find, before the ship for Afric's strand flew swiftly with the wind. The little boy, he was so poor, no goods he had to try, and as he stood and saw the ship, a tear bedimmed his eye, to think how fortune smiled on all, except on his sad lot, as if he were, by gracious heaven, neglected and forgot. The merchant and his daughter too, fair Alice, marked his grief, and with a gentle woman's heart, intent on kind relief, she bade him bring his cat to try her fortune o'er the sea. "Who knows," she said, "what she may catch in gratitude to thee?" With weeping and with sore lament he brought poor puss on board, and now the ship stood out for sea, with England's produce stored. And as she sped far out of sight, his heart was like to break. His friend was gone that shared his crust, far sweeter for her sake. Humble his lot the merchant knew, but knew not that the cook with blows and cuffs the boy assailed, and surly word and look, until his life a burden seemed too grievous to be borne, though Alice oft would pity him, so lowly and forlorn. The cross-grained cook was very angry at the kindness shown to poor Dick by Alice, and she treated him more roughly than before, and sneered at him for having sent his cat to sea. "Do you suppose," she said, "that your cat will sell for sufficient to buy a stick wherewith I may thrash you?" At length poor Whittington could endure this harsh treatment no longer, and he resolved that he would run away and seek his luck elsewhere. So he packed up his few goods in a bundle and started one morning, All Saints' Day, which is the 1st of November, and he walked as far as Holloway, which was then all fields, and there were no houses. There he sat himself down on a stone, which to this day remains, and is called Dick Whittington's Stone, and he was very sad to think how solitary he was in the world, and how badly he had fared. Moreover, he could not tell which way he should go. While he was thus considering, the bells of Bow Church, which at that time were only 6, began to ring for service, and their sound, borne on the breeze, seemed to say to him, "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." The same words would come with the chime of the bells again and over again into his head. He tried to laugh and began to cry, and still the bells rang on. "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." He shook his head and stood up and took a few steps along the road to Finchley. But he had not gone far before he heard the bells again calling out, "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." And somehow he did not fancy the Finchley road, so he turned back, and he now took the road to Enfield. But he had not taken many steps along that way before again he heard Bow bells, and they still sang in his ear, "Turn again, Whittington, thrice Lord Mayor of London." Then he laughed through his tears, and said to himself, "Lord Mayor of London! That is a strange notion. But after all, Mr. Fitzwarren was good to me, and so was Mistress Alice, and perhaps I can bear the ill nature of the cook, if I have the thought before me that I shall be Lord Mayor of London, and ride in a coach." So Dick walked back by the way he had come, and got into his master's house before the cook came downstairs. Now the very first news which came to his ears that morning, when he got back to the house, were glad tidings. Good news he quickly hears, how that a richly laden ship, amid 10,000 cheers, has entered port from distant climes, full freighted with their gold, by traffic gained for English wares, in honest barter sold. With shout and song the crew rejoiced, not less the folk on shore told of adventures strange and rare among the blackamoor, and how their king was glad to see our English sailors bold, who sat and ate and drank with him from cups of purest gold. Once a day, amid their cheer, when healths went gaily round, how were the crew amazed to see, in swarms upon the ground, unnumbered rats and mice rush forth, and seize the goodly cheer, while stood the wondering guests aloof, o'erwhelmed with dread and fear. "Oh," said the king, "what sums I'd give to rid me of such vile, detested brutes, whose ravages our bed and board defile." Now when the captain and sailors heard this, they recollected the cat of Dick Whittington. So they told the king that they had an animal on board which would rid him very speedily of all the vermin. "Bring the beast to me," said the king, "and if it be as you say, I will lade your vessel with gold dust in exchange for it." So the captain sent a sailor to the ship whilst a second dinner was being got ready. The sailor soon caught the puss, tucked her under his arm, and arrived at the palace in time to see the swarm of rats rush in to eat up the second meal that had been served. Now when the cat saw and smelt the rats, wish she went out of the sailor's arms, and away she rushed upon the rats, and nipped and killed them one after another, and those who saw her and had time fled to their holes like wind. The king laughed and kicked his feet about and clapped his hands, and was so delighted that he said he must and would have the beast, even if it cost him half his kingdom. The captain now called the cat to him and showed her to the king, who at first was afraid to touch her, but after a while, to show his manliness and his royal fearlessness, put out a finger and touched the cat, who at once began to purr. The king had never heard this sound before, and it frightened him, and he went under the table. But presently he put out his head from under the tablecloth to ask if all was safe. When he was assured that the cat would do him no harm, then, like a man and a hero, he came back to his place, and becoming bolder, with impunity patted the cat. After a while, even the queen summoned courage to caress the cat and say, "Puss, puss," whereupon the cat stepped into her lap, coiled herself up, and went to sleep. The king was now quite determined to have the cat. He bargained with the captain to buy all the rest of the ship's cargo, but in payment for the cat he gave 10 bags, all full of the finest gold dust. The captain then took leave of the king, and having a fair wind, set sail for England, and after a prosperous voyage, arrived safely in London port. This was the news that reached Dick Whittington that morning of All Saints' Day, when he returned to his master's house, and now as he heard it, he no longer thought that the Bow Bells told what was impossible, as he was master of 10 great sacks of gold dust. Now the cook was jealous, and went to Mr. Fitzwarren, and told him that all the treasure was too much for a poor scullion. But the master was a good man, and he said, "God forbid that I should rob the boy of a single penny. He shall have all the gold dust to the last pinch." Then he sent for Dick, but the boy said, "I have only hobnailed boots, and cannot go into the parlour." However, Mr. Fitzwarren insisted, and he came in very modestly, and his master told him all the truth about his good fortune, and called him Mr. Whittington. Poor Dick was overwhelmed with his good luck, and wanted the master to take half of it, but Mr. Fitzwarren said, "No, it is all your own, but what I will do is to advise you how to dispose of it." Now Dick was so kind-hearted that he made a present of some of the gold to all his fellow servants, and to the captain and sailors of the ship. He did not even neglect the cross-grained cook. After this, Mr. Fitzwarren sent for a tailor, and had Dick dressed as a gentleman, and told him he was welcome to live in his house till he could provide himself with one of his own. When Whittington's face was washed, and his hair curled, and he was dressed smart, then he looked a very handsome fellow, and that Miss Alice thought. She who had formerly looked on him with compassion, now considered him fit to be her companion, and soon afterwards her suitor, the more so because Mr. Whittington was constantly making her the prettiest presents imaginable. At the end of 3 years, Mr. Fitzwarren, perceiving the affection of Mr. Whittington and his daughter for each other, consented to unite them in marriage, and accordingly a day for the wedding was soon fixed, and they were attended to church by the Lord Mayor, the aldermen, the sheriffs, and a great number of the wealthiest merchants in London. There was a grand entertainment afterwards, at which the poor were feasted as well as the rich. History tells us that Whittington and his lady lived in great splendor and were very happy, that they had several children, that he was Sheriff of London, and 3 times afterwards Lord Mayor, that in the last year of his mayoralty he entertained King Henry V on his return from the battle of Agincourt, upon which occasion the king knighted him by the style and title of Sir Richard Whittington. It is told that he then entertained the king at a great banquet, when King Henry said, "Never had a prince such a subject," to which Whittington replied, "Never had a subject such a prince." Sir Richard Whittington constantly fed great numbers of the poor. He built a church and added a college to it, with lodgings and a yearly allowance to 13 poor scholars. He also erected a great part of St. Bartholomew's Hospital in Smithfield. History has not told us what became of the property left by him for the support of the church and the 13 poor scholars, but it is believed it was seized by King Henry VIII at the time of the Reformation, as that king seized upon many of the lands which were left for religious purposes. But those which Whittington left for building and endowing almshouses met with a better fate, and Whittington's almshouses remain to this day. Here ends the story of Whittington and his cat, from which we may see how that honesty and industry met with success, and that charity and piety are the best ornaments of the rich. End of section 13. Recording by Jeff Cahill.